the shadowed heart of Silverpine, where the dense wilderness of Mirror Woods looms like a sentient predator, I, Alex, a forest ranger with a decade of hard-earned experience, stumbled into a nightmare that defies the boundaries of reason. The low, steady hum of my truck's engine was the only sound as I navigated the winding dirt road toward the ranger station on that fateful October night, the skeletal outlines of Douglas firs and cedars clawing at the fading twilight like the fingers of some ancient, restless entity. My headlights pierced the gloom, briefly illuminating the reflective gleam of what I convinced myself were deer eyes. But I pressed onward, a shiver of unease threading through my spine. There's an unspoken dread that settles over these woods after sundown, a primal instinct that sets my teeth on edge, and on this particular evening, that sensation was amplified, thick with an almost tangible menace. Silverpine is encircled by miles of untouched wilderness, a landscape that feels like a portal to a harsher, older world, but Mirror Woods stands apart, a realm where local legends don't merely linger. They fester, woven into the very fabric of the forest. Old-timers in town whisper of a woodland alive, its paths twisting to ensnare the unwary, its shadows harboring entities that defy the light, and the chilling tale of a boy, Colin or Cody, his name lost to time, dared to abandon all hope into an ancient tree, only to vanish, leaving behind a shredded backpack and a knife as grim relics. That story ignited like wildfire through Silverpine, birthing an unspoken decree: avoid Mirror Woods at all costs. As a ranger, I'd honed my skills against bears, lost hikers, and storms, reducing fear to practical solutions. But nothing in my training prepared me for the malevolent force I encountered, an evil I now clutch proof of in my scarred hands. Journey with me through this harrowing descent, where every rustle and shadow unveils a deeper terror. Can you withstand the unseen hunger of Mirror Woods? Or will its darkness unravel your resolve? The drive to the ranger station had become a nightly ritual, the low, resonant hum of my truck's engine a tether to the familiar amidst the encroaching dark. It was mid-October, and the air carried a crisp, biting chill, laced with the rich, earthy scent of pine needles and the damp decay of fallen leaves, a heaviness that seemed to seep into my very marrow. The forest on either side loomed like a living wall, a dense thicket of Douglas firs and cedars, their gnarled branches stretching toward the twilight sky, their skeletal forms resembling the grasping hands of some forgotten giant. My headlights carved a narrow path through the gloom, occasionally catching the fleeting, reflective glint of what I told myself were deer eyes peering from the underbrush, but I didn't dare slow. The woods after sundown have always stirred a primal unease in me, a sensation that tonight felt sharper, more insistent, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting. Silverpine is a town cradled by miles of untouched wilderness, a landscape that feels like stepping into a primordial, unforgiving world. But Mirror Woods stands as its dark heart, a place where local legends don't just persist. They thrive with a malevolent vitality. The old-timers in Silverpine's dimly lit taverns spin tales of a forest alive, its paths shifting like serpents to ensnare the careless, its shadows harboring figures that move with unnatural grace, vanishing when pursued. Teenagers, fueled by reckless bravado and the thrill of the forbidden, swear they've glimpsed silhouettes darting between the trees, their forms dissolving into the mist. And then there's the story that etched itself into my youth. A boy, Colin or Cody, his name now a faded echo, dared by his friends to abandon all hope into an ancient tree deep within Mirror Woods. They found his knife, its blade dulled and smeared with earth, and his backpack, shredded like wet paper, but the boy himself was gone, swallowed by the forest as if he'd never existed. That tale spread like wildfire through Silverpine, igniting fear and birthing an unspoken rule that has governed the town for decades. Stay the hell out of Mirror Woods. As a ranger, I'd spent 10 years breaking down fears into practicalities. Clap and yell to scare off a bear, guide lost hikers downhill along a creek's steady flow, ensure the radio crackles to life during a storm. But Mirror Woods defies any ranger's manual, its mysteries resisting the cold light of reason. I'd convinced myself those stories were mere folklore, a product of isolation and imagination, until that October night shattered my illusions. A loud, jarring crack shattered my reverie, the the sound of branches snapping beneath my tires as I swerved instinctively, my hands tightening on the wheel until my knuckles whitened. A chill raced through me, though I attributed it to the cool October air seeping through the cracked window, carrying with it the faint scent of moss and decay. Squinting into the growing dark, I glimpsed a shadow too large, too solid to be a deer, its form materializing briefly at the tree line before slipping into the deeper black beyond. "Damn it, Alex," I muttered under my breath, shaking off the rising tide of nerves. The buddy system was a luxury I couldn't always afford on these late-night drives, much as I longed for a witness to share the burden of this unease. By the time I pulled into the ranger station's gravel lot, the last faint hues of sunset had bled into a murky, starless sky, the horizon swallowed by an oppressive void. Mason's truck sat out front, its hood still warm to the touch, a silent testament to his recent arrival. I lingered an extra moment, wiping my boots against the weathered mat, the warm, familiar scent of stale coffee wafting from the small office as I stepped inside. Mason was hunched over a map sprawled across the desk, his reading glasses perched low on his nose, squinting at the faded lines and contours. His usual no-nonsense gaze softened ever so slightly as I entered, a rare crack in his stoic demeanor. "You're late," he said flatly, straightening up and pulling off his glasses to rub the weariness from his eyes. "Got hung up at the trailhead?" I shrugged, shedding my jacket, the weight of the day's patrol settling into my shoulders like a leaden cloak. His hesitation was a warning bell. Mason never hesitated, his decisions always swift and decisive. "We've got a situation," he said finally, his voice subdued, carrying a weight that set my nerves alight. "A missing hiker, a college kid." I sighed, running a hand through my hair, the gesture a futile attempt to steady myself. "When was he reported?" "2 days ago," Mason replied. "Sheriff's department called it in, but search teams came up empty. They're short-staffed, so guess where they want us to look?" The pause was deliberate, a heavy silence that dropped like a stone into my gut. "No," I said, the word escaping sharper than intended, edged with a desperation I couldn't hide. "Mason, you've got to be joking." He stared back, the lines etched into his weathered face deepening, his eyes unyielding. "You know I wouldn't joke about this. Send them somewhere else." I pleaded, my tone teetering on the brink of begging. "Hell, a helicopter crew. Anyone but us. Too dense for helicopters," he countered, crossing his arms, his posture a fortress of resolve. Sheriff reached out directly. "We're it." The office shrank around me, the walls closing in as my pulse quickened, a drumbeat of dread echoing in my chest. I'd known this day might come, a shadow lurking at the edge of my consciousness, but I'd buried it deep, convincing myself it would never materialize. This kid, they're in Mirror Woods? I swallowed hard, the name tasting like ash on my tongue. Mason nodded, a single solemn gesture that confirmed my worst fears. "There's no proof they went in there," I pressed, grasping at straws. "Could be anything lost further east or, and what if they are?" He cut in, his voice rising just enough to remind me of his authority. "You want me to tell his parents we didn't bother checking? That we wrote him off because of some old ghost story?" I closed my mouth, my hands curling into fists at my sides, the leather of my gloves creaking under the pressure. Mason sighed, his tone softening, a rare concession. "Look, we'll keep it quick. In and out at first light, just a sweep of the outskirts. Any sign of him, we call it in and get backup. You won't be alone." That word, alone, burrowed into me like a thorn, its implications sharp and cold. Mason spoke as if strength in numbers could shield us from the unseen terrors lurking beneath Mirror Wood's dense canopy. But I knew better. "First light?" I repeated, my voice flat, drained of hope. He nodded, the discussion closed, turning back to his map with a finality that left no room for argument. I seized the opportunity to step outside, the air biting and claustrophobic, pressing against my chest like a physical weight. My mind spiraled, replaying the old stories, the whispered warnings, the cursed tree with its ominous inscription. Tomorrow, I would venture into Mirror Woods to test the truth of those tales, and the prospect chilled me to the bone, a shiver that had nothing to do with the night's cold. By the time we reached Pine Ridge Trail at the first light of dawn, the air was thick and wet, a suffocating overcast heaviness that seemed to seep into every pore of my skin. My shirt clung to my back beneath the bulky ranger vest, the fabric damp with sweat despite the cold that gnawed at my bones, the effort of leading the group a fleeting distraction from the dread building within. The clumping hooves of the horses reverberated dully off the packed dirt, their rhythmic plodding a steady counterpoint to the rustling pines swaying overhead, their branches swaying with a whisper that felt too quiet, too deliberate. I'd walked this trail 100 times, guided countless groups through its gentle slopes and rugged turns. But today it felt alien, the familiar landmarks warped by an unseen presence that twisted the air itself. "All right, everyone, hang back a bit," I called, lifting a hand as I slowed my horse, Dudley, to a stop, his breath visible in the chilled morning air. "Trail gets steep up ahead. Keep them steady, short heels down if someone's horse starts skittering. Don't pull too hard, they'll correct. Let me lead." The tourists stirred behind me, a small group of 4. A weathered couple from the local area, their faces etched with the lines of experience, and a college-aged kid in a bright red jacket who'd booked the ride alone, his enthusiasm a stark contrast to the growing tension in my chest. None seemed particularly concerned about our destination, which suited me fine. I had no intention of burdening them with the shadowed history of Mirror Woods. The forest's dark silhouette sprawled over our left shoulders, a silent, brooding presence that I kept to myself, its reputation a weight I bore alone. "Any chance this trail leads closer to the scary forest?" the red-jacketed kid asked, his voice too loud, a grin splitting his face as he gripped the reins awkwardly, his horse shifting beneath him with restless energy. "Closer than you'd like if you're not careful," I replied flatly, my tone clipped and curt, designed to discourage further inquiry. I nudged Dudley forward with a gentle heel, beginning the descent down the incline, the conversation behind me fading into a murmur as I focused on the trail ahead. The soft creak of leather saddles and the occasional snort of a horse filled the air as we moved, the earth soft and yielding in patches, already earmarking this trail for maintenance in my mind. "Easy there, boy," I whispered, my voice low and soothing as Dudley's hooves slipped slightly on a loose patch of mud, the damp soil glistening with the morning dew. It happened too fast. A single misstep, his front hooves sliding sideways, his weight shifting with a sickening lurch that threw me off balance. I was falling before I could correct, a sharp, jarring blow to my chest knocking the wind from my lungs as I collided with the unforgiving ground. My helmeted head snapped back against a jagged rock protruding from where mud met stone, pain exploding in a white-hot flare behind my eyes, a supernova of agony that left me gasping. I didn't even realize I was groaning until I felt the vibration shudder through my chest, my vision blurring into streaks of gray and green as dizziness and nausea tangled in a nauseating dance. Faces hovered above me, abstract shapes at first, their features indistinct through the haze of pain. "Jesus, are you okay?" a frantic voice, likely the kid in the red jacket, asked, hands gripping my arm with an urgency that bordered on panic, attempting to haul me upright. "I'm fine," I rasped, shoving weakly at the hands, forcing myself to sit despite the world tilting dangerously beneath me. "Stay with the group. I'll catch up." "You don't look fine," the voice protested, laced with concern, but I barked, "Get everyone back to the stable. Take the lead. You've got it." The reluctant shuffle of hoofbeats and low murmurs of indecision faded as they obeyed, leaving me alone with the throbbing in my skull. I sat there, waiting for the dizziness to subside, my fingertips brushing against a small, sticky patch of warmth at my temple, the coppery scent of blood mingling with the forest's damp aroma. "Head wounds bleed too much," I thought grimly, wiping the wetness on my pants before staggering unsteadily to my feet, the ground swaying beneath me like a ship on rough seas. Mason once told me that motion keeps panic at bay, a ranger's mantra to walk off the fear. So I moved, the forest closing in with every step. The trees grew closer, their skeletal limbs crowding the trail in a way they shouldn't, their bark scarred and twisted as if shaped by some malevolent hand. Pine Ridge Trail should have been orderly, its path parallel and predictable even at its worst. But this veered sharply, curving with an unnatural precision that set my pulse thudding heavily in my ears. The realization slid into place with a cold certainty. This wasn't Pine Ridge anymore. I fumbled for my radio, my gloved fingers trembling as I raised it to my mouth, static bursting loud enough to make me flinch. "Base, this is Alex," I said, my voice low but rising with a desperate edge. "I took a fall off the trail. Think I might have gone the wrong way. Current location unclear. Over." The radio crackled, a faint flicker of sound almost forming syllables before dissolving back into static, a mocking echo of my isolation. "Useless?" I muttered, lowering the dead weight, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet, a sound that bothered me more than it should. With no real plan, I kept moving forward, or what I thought was forward, the air growing heavier, damper, and colder than it had any right to be. The brambles thickened, forcing me to duck beneath low-hanging branches that clawed at my jacket like desperate hands, their thorns snagging the fabric with a tenacity that felt personal. Then, a break in the trees revealed a clearing, the transition sudden like a missing tooth in an otherwise jagged smile. Dead grass lined the uneven earth, brittle and gray under the overcast sky, but my gaze didn't settle on the ground. It climbed instead to the massive, gnarled tree at the clearing's center, its bark so dark it seemed to absorb the light, its trunk twisted as though it had grown in agony, its roots snaking through the soil like blackened veins. Carved deep into its surface were two jagged, uneven words: "Abandon all hope." The forest seemed to inhale around me, the air compressing in my lungs so tightly I couldn't move, even if I'd wanted to. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe, the jagged words gouging into the bark, pulsing with an unnatural gravity, their grooves almost blackened against the already scorched surface, crawling under my skin like a living thing. I glanced back at the way I'd come, but the trail was gone. The trees now moved too close together, their dark, skeletal branches interlocked like the ribs of some giant beast, swallowing whatever path had existed before. There weren't even hoof prints, not a single disrupted leaf or churned patch of dirt to mark Dudley or the other's passage. The hair on the back of my neck prickled, every instinct screaming to turn around, to run. But where? What good would running do when I didn't know which way to go? I exhaled again, long and slow, my hand reaching for the radio with a frantic edge, pressing the button as if sheer will could summon a response. "Base, this is Alex," I said, my throat tightening as the words tangled. "I'm off trail, some kind of clearing. I hesitated. What the hell was I going to say? That the forest was swallowing paths that shouldn't exist? That some godforsaken tree had dragged cryptic folklore up from the ground with it? "Need assistance?" I finished lamely, though I couldn't imagine what kind of help Mason or anyone at the station could offer. My thumb stayed pressed on the call button, waiting for the static to churn into Mason's voice, for anything to break the silence. The response was worse than static. It was a thick, deafening void, as if the forest itself held its breath, listening, swiping at my hope the way it had stolen the trail. I grabbed the radio again, crushing the button between my fingers. "Mason, can you hear me? Sheriff's Department? Anyone?" More static, then nothing. I released it, letting it hang uselessly at my side, its weight now an anchor dragging me down. My hand hovered at my belt, brushing the jangling edges of the compass and map, a mechanical instinct kicking in. I unrolled the map from its weatherproof pouch, smoothing it over trembling fingers, though even before I opened it fully, I knew the problem. Maps only work when the land stays still, and something deep in the marrow of my bones knew this land did not. I glanced down anyway, hoping against hope, but the lines and contours of familiar trails were suddenly a cruel joke, the shapes of the ridge and adjacent hills irrelevant to whatever this place had become. My compass remained faithful, but its needle spun erratically, jittering uselessly, unable to differentiate north from a void. "Useless," I muttered, biting the word out and stuffing the map back into its pouch. "Okay, Alex, think this through. You don't panic." My voice sounded tiny in the open, swallowed too quickly by the silence. leaving only the faint echo of the refrain in my head. My weight shifted uneasily on my boots, the damp earth sucking at my heels but giving just enough to make me notice how strangely soft the ground had become since I'd set foot here. The forest pressed heavier at my back, darker even though there was technically enough light to see. Somewhere far away, a crow cawed once, sharp and urgent, but it didn't ease my solitude. It sharpened the wrongness of this stretch of land. There should have been more crows, squirrels scrambling loudly, insects chirping defensively for dominance. There should have been life, not this void, not just the godforsaken tree. And wasn't that the worst part? I wasn't moving, and yet I was still being drawn to it. That cruel carving of abandon, all hope acting like a lighthouse for the shattered. It stood defiant in the clearing, its blackened roots snaking visibly through the ground like veins or fractures, as if it had grown wrong or clawed its way here from somewhere it didn't belong. I needed to go, to turn around, pick a direction, any direction. Screw the tree, screw Mirror Woods, screw the kid who'd wandered in here in the first place. But my feet didn't move. Instead, my gaze dragged upward, higher than the jagged words I'd already memorized. The limbs were bent the same way the trunk twisted, but more wrong, like someone had broken them by hand and never set them right. The bark, the longer I looked, revealed scores and scratches climbing the trunk that weren't natural at all. They weren't random either. They were wide, slashing gouges, claw marks too broad for a bear, too deep for even the sharpest tools. My stomach sank as my mind scratched unwillingly through the ghost stories, grasping whatever details were easiest to recall, twisting paths and swallowing the careless. I mumbled it aloud, my rational instincts hating me for giving voice to the thought, my gut instincts telling me I was basically screwed anyway. I needed more information, or failing that, a way to make forward motion hurt less than the already unbearable present. The tree dominated the clearing, but the brutal earth around it made my boots pause again. The longer I stood here, the more my sense of distance seemed to taper and blur. I didn't want to admit what my gut was concluding. Stepping toward the tree felt like stepping into the center of a trap, but staying here wasn't viable, so I picked a path. I glanced at my phone, swiping the screen to life. Not that I expected much out of a signal. I just wanted the ritual of trying, a dose of sanity in an already erratic chain of events. The screen read, "No service," in the corner, same as before, figures. But my eyes froze when they registered something else. Faint, just faint enough on the black background. There wasn't service, but there was a flicker, a pair of bars appearing briefly and then disappearing immediately. Motion, a ghost signal. I turned the screen toward the gaps between the crooked trees, catching direction, bars again, followed by text. My chest tightened as I read slowly, carefully. "Come inside." The first step past the tree felt like pressing my foot against the chest of some sleeping animal. The air moving dense, warm, alive in a way that made my stomach knot. That faint flicker of "come inside" from the phone haunted the edge of my mind as I moved forward, each step deliberate but reluctant, like my body wasn't entirely my own. The clearing was behind me now, swallowed in the twisted, gnarled wall of trees that appeared overhead, their skeletal branches damn near blotting out the thin gray light struggling to come through. Even my breathing sounded wrong here, too loud, too fragile. I pressed on, my heartbeat drumming in double time, boots crunching over pine needles and half-rotted leaves, every noise seeming to stretch and linger in the frigid quiet. Rustling behind me hinted at disturbances that didn't align with the natural sway of branches or the scurry of animals. Faint, irregular sounds that belonged to nothing I could name, despite years of navigating wilderness trails. At times, it felt like the trail beneath my boots twisted slightly behind me, curling sideways and back on itself like some sentient, coiling thing. I paused, dragging the edge of my boot along the ground to mark a crude X into the soil, my knife following to notch just deep enough into a nearby trunk that it felt permanent. But as I squinted down the crooked, dark corridor of trees, unease welled in my chest. I couldn't swear I'd recognize the spot again if I circled back. That knot in the bark, a raised root, it all looked identical 5 steps later. I bent, yanking another thin root into my hand and tied it tightly to a low-hanging branch. Even as the knot secured, I caught myself whispering aloud, like a reflex, "Insurance, Alex. Landmarks don't move. except when they really do. The attempt at humor sounded weak, even to me, a fragile shield against the growing terror. The air grew thicker the farther I went, clinging to my skin like damp fabric, my coat overheating me 1 second. The next I was shivering against the unwelcome chill of the forest. The contrast burned my nerves raw, each breath catching slightly under the weight pressing down in the space. A bead of sweat rolled along my temple. Whether from exertion or anxiety, I couldn't tell. I stopped to lean against a moss-choked log fallen across the trail, if you could even call it a trail anymore, the path overgrown to the point where I was hacking away at the brush with my knife every few steps. As my weight pressed into the log, my fingertips brushed over its surface. The wood beneath the thick moss gnarled and splintered, almost rubbery against my gloves. The damp things smelled like wet rot, and for some stupid, irrational reason, I yanked my hand back quickly, convinced it had moved. I wiped my damp hand against my pants, frustration rising hot in my chest. It wasn't just the smell or the silence, stretched taut as wire. It was everything. The way the trees doubled back into one another, the growing sense that each inch forward dragged me further into a net I couldn't see. My head throbbed faintly, likely leftover adrenaline from the fall, though each faint stab felt sharper beneath the veil of unnatural quiet. I was just deciding whether to push forward or double back, praying my X on the ground would have stayed put, when movement ahead caught me like the snap of a branch. At first, it was subtle, through the mangled limbs of the dead trees. Figures, faint and blurry, hunched at odd angles, framed unnaturally against the fog veiling the wood's edge. My chest eased with an involuntary, absurd release of tension at the pure relief that other people might be out here. That warmth fizzled quickly as the details bled into focus. 3 of them, spaced evenly apart, unmoving. "Hey!" The word escaped my mouth before logic could shove it back. My voice carrying louder than I'd have liked in the quiet, but it didn't seem to register with them. I stepped closer, boots crunching softly, practically wincing at every sound my weight made against the trail's uneven floor. The first figure, a man, didn't flinch, didn't look up. He stood wrong, silhouetted against the skeletal branches, his posture agonizingly stiff, as if suspended by invisible wires. His entire body seemed to curve wrong, his weight tipping too far forward, just enough to make me sick with the certainty that he shouldn't be upright at all. "Hey!" I tried again, louder. "Do you need help?" Still nothing. His head pitched slightly downward, as though staring directly into the forest floor, his neck not seeming fully connected, or if it was, maybe it had bent too long under pressure, not built for a human frame. A woman stood a few yards behind him, her presence even worse. Her frame was barely visible through the mist of gray light, but what I could see raised the hairs on the back of my neck. Her arms hung too long at her sides, paler than anyone I'd ever seen. Her skin almost translucent, unreal. When she moved, it wasn't right. Her head turned toward me unervingly slow, halting suddenly at a horrifying angle. For one heartbeat, her glassy, hollow eyes locked directly onto mine, and I froze, my breath snagged short, catching in my throat. The man moved next, not a natural motion, not someone stretching or stepping forward. It wasn't even a turn exactly. His entire stance shifted in jagged, segmented movements, like a marionette being jerked to attention. My pulse rammed against my ribs as I realized the third figure, deeper in the fog, was still changing too, joining the other 2 in an unsettling unison I didn't want to think too hard about. I needed to step back, my boot crunching faintly, and found my voice caught between an inhale and a scream. "Stay back!" I barked, retreating another step, my voice slicing through the stillness sharply, but still none of them spoke. They only stared, unblinking, blank, full of something dark I couldn't understand but could feel crawling toward me the longer I stood there. The woman's mouth began to stretch wide, inhumanly wide, my heart shooting into my throat. I ran. I didn't care how it sounded or how sloppy it made me look. Running felt sane in a moment where nothing else had. My boots skidded wildly over uneven earth, hands fumbling at branches that slapped against my shoulders as I tore back into the woods. Was I even retracing my steps? Probably not. My vision blurred, Not from exhaustion, but raw panic gripping every nerve in me. The forest didn't seem to like that. Each attempt to regain distance felt harder, roots snagging at my feet like grasping hands, as the skeletal trees swayed without wind. That smell of moss and rot grew heavier, suffocating every breath. I swear I could hear faint crunching behind me, measured, careful, don't turn around. Branches broke in tandem with my ragged breathing, indistinct figures flickering always at the blurred edges of my vision. Every nerve in my body screamed to move, though my legs already snarled under exhaustion. The silence around me hadn't grown. It had deepened, concentrated, waiting for something inevitable. That inevitability found me when I stumbled finally against an uprooted trunk, falling hard against the damp soil. My radio crackled faintly at my chest, followed by a single word drenched in static that I swear wasn't mine. Run. The silence snapped first, faint static crackling against my chest, dragging cold claws down my spine. Run. The word fizzled like a fraying wire, as though the forest had borrowed a piece of my voice to spit it back at me. But whether the radio survived the fall or not didn't matter. The air had moved again, that dense wrongness folding in on me, thicker, suffocating, alive. Behind me, crunching, slow, deliberate. I froze, still sprawled over the damp soil, hands clawing at the wet ground for leverage. A sharp crack reverberated behind me. A snapping branch, maybe, or bone. My hands trembled against the earth. I didn't want to turn. Every instinct screamed that whatever I thought I would see wouldn't compare to reality. But fear works like gravity, pulling even when you resist. I turned. It was the woman I saw first, her translucent frame stepping closer, slowly, deliberately, almost leisurely in a way that made my breath come sharp and shallow. Her limbs shook mid-step, as if something still learning how a human body should move controlled her. Her long, pale arms swinging limply at her side. Her wide grin hadn't hesitated. In fact, it stretched even further now, jagged teeth catching faint traces of dim gray light filtering through the skeletal canopy above. Behind her, the figure on all fours emerged from the mist, its bloated, distorted, swollen body lumbering forward heavily, long clawed nails gouging into the damp earth as it crawled with far more speed than something that shape should have had. Its mottled, greenish skin seemed to ripple with every ugly movement, exuding a sheen like slick oil, its predatory eyes glinting wetly through folds of misshapen flesh. I felt vomit rise, sharp and hot in the back of my throat, at the thought that it wasn't exhaling so much as releasing a low, resonant growl that vibrated deep in my chest. Both of them lurched forward at the same time, unnatural jerks of motion like puppets on strings being yanked too hard. My muscles locked before adrenaline finally shoved me back into motion, a shuffle backward trying to steady my breath and my hands. Then snap. The sound beneath my boot was sharp, impossibly loud against the eerie quiet. Something brittle and wrong gave beneath me. A dried root, maybe, but the way their heads snapped sharply toward the sound made the air rush out of my lungs. No, 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 no. The string of words left my mouth barely above a breath, like a reflex I couldn't control. The woman smiled wider. How could it stretch further? And her head cocked violently to one side, the sound of her vertebrae grinding enough to make me gag. She let out a soft, wet laugh, high-pitched and piercing, like air escaping a tear in something, and darted forward. I scrambled to my feet, nearly falling again as panic overtook practicality, my boot catching on another raised root. I shoved myself upright violently, ignoring the burn in my calves, and ran. Branches tore at my coat, catching at my sleeves as I barreled into the swallowing darkness of the woods. The laughter followed. Behind it, a guttural roar had joined the chase. My mind bled static, the thumping of my heartbeat drowning out everything. I gasped, lungs compressing under the weight of terror. My voice too loud, drawing attention I didn't want, but my mind couldn't stop sliding off its axis. Somewhere far off, or maybe too close, a sharp crackle reverberated, then another staggered. It couldn't have been them, not when their movements were already impossibly quiet. A twig snapped far to my left, breaking my line of thought. Something else started quickly, indistinct and shadowed between the gnarled base of the trees. Focus. My voice came out hoarse, cracking as I veered sharply to the right, forcing my boots to dig into the sinking, moss-choked earth. I glanced behind me just once, just to see, big mistake. The pale woman's face was horrifyingly close, her hollow eyes locking with mine in a dead, unblinking crawl that twisted my gut inside out. Her grin snapped wider, bathed in fog, before she lunged. For one terrifying moment, her jagged teeth looked like they belonged around my throat. I yanked my sidearm up on instinct, firing blindly into her chest. The recoil of the gun snapped my wrist, the sound splitting the heavy quiet like thunder. The force knocked her back, her limp frame pitching bizarrely sideways as the bullet drove between her collarbone and shoulder. For a split second, hope sparked, sharp and desperate. Maybe I'd gotten lucky, maybe, but the woman didn't fall. Her entire body flinched unnaturally, jerking like it was caught mid-spasm, the grin never falling. The wet gurgle of laughter grew louder as she straightened back up, angling her head far too much to one side as she regarded me. Her chest gaped open darkly where the bullet had shredded straight through. She didn't bleed. No. The word felt like gravel in my chest. I fired again, this time aiming for her head. The bullet tore straight through the ghostly white skull, shattering part of her cheekbone. For another second, she stilled, but then came the awful sound, that laugh. It started like a choke, sharp and guttural, before it twisted upward into a pitch so sharp it seared the edges of my mind. Her head jumped as the piercing, wet sound bubbled from her throat. Something heavy crashed loud behind her, and I caught sight of the bloated figure charging on all fours, saliva drooling thickly from its deformed jaws, its claws gleaming. My brain screamed. I turned and bolted. The pale woman's shrieking laugh grew louder and heavier as she gave chase, feet dragging unnaturally fast across the soil as her distorted limbs jerked violently behind her. The bloated figure let out another guttural roar that made my gut clench until I thought I'd be sick. I couldn't hear my feet anymore over the sound of their pursuit, over my own blood rushing furiously through my ears. Branches slapped and clawed at my face, small cuts digging into my skin, but I didn't dare slow. The air stank of decay now, rotten, damp, suffocating. My chest heaved as I forced myself to put every bit of strength I had into each step. Another crackle of my radio, faint static filled, but there again, I couldn't make out words, but some piece of that sound forced me to focus forward, to keep moving. The laughter behind me escalated, sharp and jagged to the point of breaking. Too loud, too close. God damn it, I growled, shoving through another low tangle of branches, panic coursing white-hot through my legs. The forest seemed endless, branches spinning into indistinct shapes, trees folding endlessly in on themselves, the light dimming with every step. I wasn't moving forward, I was being led. Ahead of me, something flickered faintly between the trees, not light exactly, but movement. Movement I prayed belonged to someone, anyone with a pulse. Help? My voice cracked, pushing through the burn of raw fear. The figures chasing me didn't relent. The crunch, thud, scrape of them dragging impossibly fast across the forest floor closed too close. Laughter cut jagged edges into my mind like rusted barbs. Her laughter, its growl, things that shouldn't exist. The forest was eating my breath. My pulse roared louder. I ran harder. Running should have felt like salvation, like I was clawing my way back toward my life, but every step felt more like I was burrowing into its stomach. The chase behind me wasn't just something heard, it was something felt, weight in the air, vibrations in the ground, the kind that rattled your teeth if you stayed too long. I thought about glancing back, pure animal instinct driving the need to know how close they were, but I didn't dare. The laughter was already embedding itself behind my eyes, that stretch, hollow gurgle from her throat and the low, furious growl of it. They were so close I barely heard the snap of branches ahead as my boot caught on a hidden root. The ground met me hard before I even knew I was falling, damp dirt flooding my mouth, the metallic taste of blood mixing with moss and rot as my chin struck against the forest floor. My sprawled arms tore through the underbrush, scratches flaring white-hot, pain up to my forearms. I tried to scramble back to my feet, but my wrist buckled beneath me, leaving me collapsed and tangled in grasping roots, like they'd been waiting for me to trip. The sound of pursuit exploded behind me. Tree limbs cracking, underbrush snapping, something slick dragging through the leaves. They weren't holding back anymore. Even without looking, I could feel them bearing down, close enough that the stink of rot was in my mouth, my throat. "Get up if you want to live." The voice came out of nowhere, gruff, southern, sharp with urgency, cutting through the scream clogging my throat. A hand, rough and strong, latched onto my arm like a steel cable before I could think. It yanked me upright so fast my boot heel barely scraped the ground, blood rushing to my head, dizziness pinning me in place for a terrifying second. "What?" I choked out, spinning blindly toward him. "Move!" The man growled before I could slow us both down with a full sentence. His grip moving to the back of my collar, half shoving, half dragging me forward. I stumbled, nearly falling again, but his hand never loosened. Behind us, something hit the ground hard, the snapping crunch of claws gouging into earth, and my stomach clenched. The man's voice snapped again, barking down my hesitation like he had claws of his own. I said, "Move your damn legs. Ain't got time for gawking." The lantern he carried bumped wildly as he surged forward, pulling me with him, its greenish glow throwing shards of sickly light across the forest, making the twisting trees look like they were writhing alive and grinning. The rattling cylinder threw my shadow long and jagged behind us, stretching it toward the shapes chasing us. Every instinct screamed, "Don't look," but I heard the pale woman's laugh pulse closer, slicing through bone and thought alike. "Shut it, you toothy!" The man shouted back at her over his shoulder, his tone dripping with venom and no small bit of mockery. "I know your game, you don't scare me. You hear me? Not today." What the hell? Some part of my brain, the one still clinging desperately to logic, wanted to ask 1,000 questions right there. Who is this guy? How does he know them? What the hell is happening here? But terror squeezed my chest like a vice, reducing my voice to frantic, heaving breaths, each one feeling too precious to waste. "Faster," he hissed, "unless you plan on dying ugly." The ground blurred beneath my boots as I followed him, my legs burning with the kind of exhaustion that felt more permanent than just tonight. Only adrenaline kept me upright, that and the clear knowledge that whatever my imagination thought those things would do to me, the reality would be worse. The man moved like he knew the forest better than it knew itself, his heavy, uneven boots kicking up wet soil as he veered sharply left through an almost invisible gap between the trees. I realized too late the trail had disappeared entirely. There was no path anymore, just curling, grasping fingers of bramble and branches that tore at our clothes as we pushed through them. "Follow my steps," he barked, never slowing. "Do not stop for anything, you hear me? Not to breathe, not to think. Sure as hell not to look behind." A scream nearly escaped me when something cracked behind us, louder than before. Claws or teeth or whatever unholy thing they had. It crunched through a branch thick enough that I could have sworn it vibrated through the air. I shoved my legs to move faster, my whole body tearing through every burned-out bit of energy reserve I barely had left. The man spared no glance over his shoulder, his voice coming low, almost a mutter, but I heard it in the unnatural stillness of the forest around us. "They always cheat, stretch the rules any chance they get." What the hell does that mean?" I sputtered, managing just enough breath to shout it at his back. He didn't answer, not directly. "It's boundaries," he hissed, flicking the lantern toward a line of twisted trees ahead that seemed older, darker than the ones choking the rest of this place. "Everything plays inside its own space. Their space." He punctuated that last word with a sharp glance at me, his dark eyes boring into mine like he was trying to hammer it into my skull. "Unless they get bold. Seen it before. This place makes its own damned rules when you let it." Then I gasped, "How do you—" "Stop talking." His voice turned flat, leaving no room for protest. "And run." I didn't argue, I couldn't. The roar behind us had deepened into something guttural, predatory. Not just chasing but hunting, dragging into my chest like a second heartbeat. The pale woman's shriek broke high and sharp, clipping the air like a splinter shoving into my temples. It didn't even sound human anymore. Not that it really had before. The man laughed now, sharp and humorless. "They're eager tonight. Goddamn show-offs, the lot of them." I stumbled on a raised root, catching myself just as a flash of the lantern glow illuminated his hand, gesturing wildly in front of me. "Here," he barked. "Tunnel through. Don't hesitate." Immediately, he ducked down low, squeezing under a sharp cluster of brambles that seemed to body a dark archway where no path before had existed. I followed, throwing myself into the claustrophobic gap before doubt could freeze my muscles. The branches scratched at my arms and shoulders, pulling strands of my hair loose as the air tightened around us. This path was impossibly narrow and barely visible, a crooked tunnel like the forest wanted desperately to close it off. I dragged myself through, knees bruising against gnarled roots, as the sound of laughter swelled deafeningly behind. The pale woman's snarls reverberated now, oscillating between her shrieked laughter and small, disgusting murmurs of incomprehensible gibberish, just louder than the crunch of the bloated figure's claws. I hauled myself forward, body trembling beneath the sheer weight of it all. The man's movements were relentless, more a force of nature than flesh in that moment, and just as my muscles began to fail me again, just as my arms swayed from exhaustion and nausea overtook the edges of my mind, his growl cut through the noise one more time. "Almost there. Pray if you're the type, if not, run harder." It felt like there was no end. Each stride seemed more impossible than the last, every tree melting into the next as though the forest itself was winding tighter around us. The pale woman's laugh stabbed through the woods, serrated and piercing, an infection creeping behind my ears, and the thing crawling with her, the bloated figure. Its guttural growls felt like teeth in my spine, as if just the sound of it could peel the air from my lungs. The stranger didn't let up. He moved like something half-feral himself, dragging me through the tangled web of roots and brambles that clawed at my clothes and skin. My legs were threatening to buckle, no matter how much adrenaline stormed through me, and parts of my vision blurred at the edges, tunneling into exhaustion. Still, his grip on my collar didn't loosen as he pulled me along. "Keep moving," he barked over his shoulder, his voice a growl that cut through the maniacal laughter and snarls. "Don't let it slow you. Just run." I didn't know where my strength was coming from anymore. Each step was blind instinct, a refusal to let everything behind me win. Still, I stumbled, my breathing sharp and shallow, my thigh screaming with pain as it caught a jagged thorn. The stranger shoved me upright again, like he'd anticipated the fall. "Come on." His tone cracked like a whip. "Keep your damn legs under you." "How much?" I gasped, the words barely above a whisper. "How much further?" He didn't answer me this time, he didn't have to. Through the blur of movement and suffocating dark, something snapped into focus ahead of us. A jagged silhouette rose above the gnarled treetops, marking the edge of this choking labyrinth. My heart jumped violently when recognition struck, like someone had scraped ice along my skull. The scorched warning tree. I'd seen it before, years ago, back when every ranger was assigned a quiet, chilling crash course on the forest's most infamous horrors. Its blackened roots sprawled outward like frozen fire, twisted and warped. Its trunk charred but standing, bore the blunt and harsh warning abandon all hope carved deep into its brittle bark. A landmark, a line in the dirt. It shouldn't have meant safety, but something in my chest moved, some fragile hope I didn't dare touch. I nearly tripped again as my legs hesitated at the memory. The laughter, her laughter, spiked when we veered closer. It rolled over me in waves, louder, sharper, clawing at my thoughts as if her voice could splinter my bones if it pushed hard enough. Behind it, the bloated figure's roars deepened, heavier, angrier, sounding like the very forest was groaning under their weight. The stranger hissed sharply and pushed me harder to the edge. "Move!" he snapped. The ground beneath us changed suddenly as we neared the tree, thinning into brittle, dry soil that cracked underfoot. The air moving too, colder here, like something in the forest itself withdrew, retreating. My pulse thundered as I reached the tree's edge, skidding to an uneven stop while the stranger spun around, his lantern casting warped, flickering light across the blackened bark. Then came their howls, The pale woman was the first to emerge, stepping into the fractured, sickly light of the lantern with that horrid, gaping smile stretched beyond sanity. Her hollow eyes burned into mine as she stopped just short of the tree's edge, her motions jerky and sharp, as if she were straining against something unseen. Somewhere behind her, the bloated figure appeared, its wet growl twisting into an enraged howl as its massive, deformed body skidded to a sudden stop. They stopped. The pale woman tilted her head, twitching it sharply to one side with an ugly grinding sound. She balled her clawed hands at her sides, eyes narrowing like a predator denied its meal. Her grin finally hesitated, just a fraction, but it settled into something far worse, a look of loathing, of hunger. Her mouth twisted as she pushed forward, testing the edge. She couldn't cross. Neither of them could. I didn't understand why, but they wouldn't. The pale woman's piercing scream pierced the air as she slammed her foot against the ground furiously, snarling, her translucent body shaking as though straining against a leash, her mouth gurgling with guttural, choking murmurs. Behind her, the bloated figure released an ear-splitting roar, clawing at the ground just beyond the tree's roots, too massive to lunge forward past the invisible boundary. I jerked backward, stumbling closer to the charred trunk. The stranger turned, his shadow stretching long behind him, his sharp grin illuminated by the sickly glow of the lantern. He spit onto the ground toward their direction and raised his free hand, waving mockingly at the two distorted forms. "Y'all keep trying," he drawled without breaking his stride. "Real entertaining, maybe next time." This time, I did find my voice hoarse and cracked as it was. What's stopping them?" He didn't glance back as he spoke, casually but with a dark edge that sent my stomach twisting. "Rules," he said simply. "Even they've got rules. Learned that the hard way." The pale woman screeched again, a distorted, hollow sound that rattled the air itself. I swore her piercing gray eyes flicked toward me for just a moment longer, a searing, hateful hunger that burned into my mind. Before I could say anything else, the stranger turned to me, his rough hand catching mine. I instinctively flinched back, but instead of shoving or dragging me, he pressed something small into my palm. I stared down at the object, my chest heaving. A card, rectangular, yellowed and slightly damp, its edges frayed, no writing, no markings, just a smooth, worn surface on both sides. "What?" I started, my voice raw. "Hold on to it," he said, cutting me off, his sharp eyes flicking briefly over each shoulder before they locked onto me again. "And next time, try not to be so loud. Wait." I grabbed at his arm blindly as he turned away, the words pouring out rapid and desperate, even as I didn't really know what I was asking. What are those things? What's happening? Who are you?" "No time," he said plainly, shaking my hand off. "You'll figure it out soon enough." His grim tone carried an undertone of something unsettling, like he expected me to know too much if I waited long enough, before I could demand answers or before I could collapse from sheer exhaustion. He disappeared into the dense darkness of the woods, lantern clinking as it bounced, leaving behind no trace of his presence except the faint stink of oil and the card sweating damp into my palm. The pale woman screamed once more, a blood-curdling howl that reverberated all the way through my teeth. My breath hitched, but her hollow eyes didn't follow me as she and the bloated figure began to retreat, pulling back into the folds of the forest. Then they were gone. I dropped to my knees at the base of the warning tree, my entire body trembling as though the forest still lurked inside me, clawing its way out. Blood dripped from my torn sleeves, tallying every cut, bruise, and broken nerve in my body, but none of that mattered. The world beyond the edges of the tree blurred and folded, fading into the quiet of the woods. The earth beneath me pressed hard against my palms, warm, vomit bubbled in my throat, but I held it back as waves of exhaustion hit heavier and heavier until I slumped fully against the scorched bark of the tree. The last thing I heard before darkness dragged me down was whispering, soft, insistent, and everywhere at once. Then nothing. I woke to the humming buzz of sterile white light, a sound that drilled straight into the base of my skull, turning the edges of my vision watery. Blinking against it felt like dragging my eyelids through sandpaper, my body pulsing under a weight I couldn't see, as though something impossibly heavy had stretched itself across every muscle and nerve. The first sound I registered after the hum of fluorescence was the steady beep of a monitor somewhere close, a mechanical heartbeat that anchored me to the present. My left arm was stiff, something tugging when I tried to move it, and 4 needle blinking faintly pink in my distorted vision. My right hand shook on instinct, though faint stings crawled up my wrist when I clenched my fingers too hard, the grip of memory flaring red-hot for just a second. Rough bark, damp soil, the stranger's cold card. The card. I sat up far too quickly. Pain seared through my ribs, the hospital room tilting violently as the edges of my vision darkened. A low groan spilled out of me before I could catch it. "Take it easy." The voice was steady, gruff, and far too familiar. I blinked until focus ground its way back. Shadow outlines gradually sharpening into clean white walls and someone seated just off to the left. A stocky frame, silver beard, a green Ranger jacket that had seen just as much wear as I had. Ranger Mason. Mason? My voice was shredded, every word rasping against some raw place in my throat. "What? Don't push it." Mason cut in gently, but with that unflinching weight of authority only he seemed to have. His hands rested on his knees, still as stone. "You've been out all night. Figured you'd need a minute." I blinked at him, then back at my surroundings. The narrow hospital bed beneath me, the muted green curtain drawn just enough to give me a view of the door, the stack of machines humming faintly beside me. Something sharp pricked at the edges of memory again. Forest shadows twisting, the pale woman's serrated laughter still lodged somewhere behind my ears. My stomach clenched hard against the image. "What happened?" My words cracked like dry leaves. Mason's sharp eyes studied me just a moment too long, leaning forward in his chair, his voice calm but weighted with something unreadable. "The horseback team came back without you," he said plainly. "Said you split off from the group, off westward toward the basin. When you didn't show up a few hours later, they raised the alarm." I stared at him, mute. Westward. The word twisted oddly in my chest, part memory, part dread. "They formed a search group," Mason continued. "Every ranger we had plus a couple locals spread out for hours. Storm came through around midnight, cold as hell. By morning we'd figured." He stopped there, reaching up to rub a broad hand down his jaw. "We thought you weren't coming back. But you found me." My mouth felt dry when I said it, bloodless. He nodded slowly, his stare sharpening just slightly, like he was searching for something in my face. "Nate, the older guy who runs the Western Trail outpost, he spotted you near the warning tree, close to dawn. You were out cold, banged up pretty bad. Looked like you'd been tearing through brambles for hours, or running." His voice dipped lower on the last word, the implication barely audible, but it still landed square in my gut. "I was running." The response came faster than I'd meant it to, dragging the memory of the chase back to the front of my mind. Mason almost flinched, his chair creaking just slightly as he crossed his arms, one boot tapping lightly against the tile floor. "Almost there, wasn't I?" I started, hesitated. "Did anyone find anything else at the warning tree?" Another long pause from Mason now, the room cooling with his silence. His mouth worked for a moment, just a slight twitch in his loosened jaw, before he answered. "What were we supposed to find?" It wasn't a challenge, not quite, but his tone carried enough weight to tell me he was dissecting every muscle of my reaction. The question froze me, every sharp detail from the previous night simmering just under the surface. The pale woman's hollow grin, God, those eyes, the pounding roars, the snapping claws, and the stranger's careless, half-fatal drawl. "You'll figure it out soon enough." "No," I said finally, lower now, shaking my head as if that could erase everything. "Never mind." Mason stared for another beat, long enough that the muscles in my shoulders started to cramp. Finally, he exhaled, hands braced against his knees as he stood. "Doctor will be in soon," he said, changing back into that signature Ranger Mason practicality, a human anchor in any storm. "You'll be off duty for a while, but it looks like you'll live. Lucky as hell you didn't take permanent damage." I nodded mutely, watching as he moved toward the door. Before he left, he paused. One hand braced lightly on the edge of the curtain. "Get your bearings first," he said without turning back. "But if there's anything that didn't sit right out there, anything we should know, you come to me. No one else. You understand?" I swallowed hard, but I nodded. "Yeah. Good." His voice softened just slightly, the first trace of something warmer since I'd woken. Then he slipped out the door, its heavy weight clicking softly back into place. For what felt like a long stretch, I just sat there, staring at the empty space he left behind. My chest ached every time I tried piecing the last 12 hours back together. It was all fractured snapshots. Jerky laughter and sharp claws, glowing lantern light, damp oak, and the stranger's rough hand catching me before everything else could. My grip tightened against my stiff blanket. Then the memory of his hand flashed red-hot across my senses again, the object he'd pressed into my palm. I fumbled suddenly, yanking at the edge of the nightstand beside me. My movement rattled the floor against my skin as I shoved aside the bland hospital-issued water cup and a packet of pills I hadn't noticed, groping blindly for it. There, the card felt heavier than I'd remembered, even though it shouldn't have weighed anything at all. Its yellowed surface was faintly damp, frayed at the edges like it had been left in water just long enough to warp. A blank expanse stretched across both sides, smooth, untouched, too clean for its condition. But when I turned it over, my breath caught. An etching almost too faint to see, but there nonetheless. A set of coordinates scratched into the surface by something sharp, a blade maybe, or even just a crude nail. My blood slowed to a crawl just looking at them, because I knew, without plotting them exactly, where they pointed Mirror Woods. My heart surged painfully in my chest, a hard, impelling clamor fighting to be heard over everything else. Carefully, I slid the card into the drawer, covering it haphazardly with the cup before pressing myself harder into the pillows. Vitals check. The perky voice made me jump. I caught sight of the nurse breezing in, clipboard in one hand, a digital cuff in the other. She didn't notice or didn't care. How pale I must have looked. "You gave everyone quite the scare," she said casually, flipping through the thin pile of notes clipped to the board as she snapped the cuff around my arm. "Good thing that visitor left you with a little good luck." "Huh?" I froze. "Visitor. MHM?" She hummed without looking up, tightening the cuff before glancing at the screen attached to my fore. "Apparently, they stopped by while you were still passed out. Left you a little something. Strange type, from what I've heard." I tried to push the words past my dry throat. "What? Who did?" The nurse shrugged, slipping the cuff off again. "Didn't leave a name. Just odd. But hey, you're on the mend. You'll do fine." She smiled brightly. It felt detached, distant, as she tucked her clipboard under her arm and breezed out with a quick, "Buzz the desk if you need anything." Once she was gone, I was alone again. Cold sweat had already plastered the back of my thin hospital gown against my skin. My heart thudded numbly in my ears as my blurred gaze flicked toward the drawer where the card waited. I didn't know what the stranger wanted, or why the pale woman stopped at that godforsaken tree, or why rules even mattered to things like that. But slowly, steadily, the idea that I'd get to leave this behind started shredding like paper. I stared toward the door Mason had left through, and I made the quiet decision to keep the card to myself. The day they discharged me, Silverpine greeted me with one of those crisp autumn mornings. So clear and still it almost felt wrong. The parking lot outside the hospital was bathed in cold sunlight, the light sharp and white against the Green Ranger SUVs peppered through the spaces. The air had that bite to it, a chill that woke you up before the breath left your body. Frost shimmering faintly on windshields but already beginning to melt. It should have felt invigorating, alive, but even as I stepped out, breathing in the sharp tang of pine and cold dirt, it didn't chase off the weight of what sat behind my ribs. "They found me near the warning tree days ago." Days. The word snagged somewhere in the marrow of my skull, gnawing at my thoughts. I should have had enough time to pull myself together, to shake that malignant tension out of my shoulders. But the stillness in the air now, it wasn't soothing, it was waiting. "Hey, glad you're upright at least." Gavin's voice startled me, his boots crunching softly against the frost-speckled pavement as he approached. hands stuffed firmly into his jacket pockets. He gave me a crooked little grin, but the strain behind his eyes was clear, leftovers from too many unanswered questions and an unshakable tension that wrapped around every ranger since the search. "Barely?" I rasped, voice still raw though less than it had been. I gestured vaguely toward myself, the loose civilian flannel over my shoulders, the stiffness in the bandage still wound tight around my arm. "They said I'm off duty for a while. Mason told me to quit trying to argue." Gavin snorted faintly, his brow lifting. Bet Mason didn't have to say that twice. The attempt at humor was thin, almost apologetic. I gave him a faint nod, too tired to muster much of a response, my body moving on its own, hands fumbling to adjust the straps on the small duffel slung over one shoulder. His eyes flicked almost imperceptibly toward the arm with the bandage, like the weight of his glance alone could pull a better story out of me. "You sure you're okay?" he asked, quieter now. The frost crunched under my boots, and I focused on the way it sounded. Familiar, material, real. "Couple scrapes?" I said softly. "Nothing major." That earned me a dubious glance, but to his credit, Gavin didn't push it, not outright anyway. He worked his jaw briefly, nodding half to himself before stepping aside and gesturing toward one of the SUVs. "Mason wanted you to check in at the station before you head home. Something about paperwork." "Of course he does," I muttered. "Want to ride over?" I hesitated a split second too long, and Gavin's hand brushed against his pocket zipper, like he was offering me an excuse not to answer. "Nah," I said finally, adjusting the weight of my bag on my shoulder. "I'll walk. Could use the air." This time he hesitated. There was something unreadable lingering in his expression, etched just beneath the surface. Not pity exactly, but something softer, something careful, like he wanted to add something else. Questions, concerns, a reminder that normal people didn't just vanish on the westward trails for hours, only to wander back from the line of certain death without a shred of clarity. Instead of saying anything, he just gave me one solemn nod. "Right, we'll see you there." I waited until he'd climbed into the SUV before I let my shoulders tighten again. Gravel churned under his tires as he backed out, rounding the curb and disappearing beyond the lot. Once he was gone, the silence felt heavier. The ranger station was absurdly warm when I stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of pine cleaner and brewed coffee. I caught a few familiar faces at first glance. Brenda hunched over the dull screen of the front desk computer, some of the younger volunteers wrapped in fleece jackets as they sorted through maps and compasses on the narrow counter nearby. Their mild chatter stopped briefly when I stepped through the door. It lasted maybe half a second, but it was long enough. "Hey, Alex," Brenda greeted me, her voice slow, deliberate in the way she bent my name, steering into casualness like she thought it'd keep me from noticing the sharp flicker of curiosity behind her gaze. "Mason said to let him know as soon as you got here." I nodded again, lips too dry to muster a real response. She kept watching, though noticing, calculating. The young volunteers whispered something to each other before weaving past me toward the gear bins, their voices shrinking against the sound of my boots over the polished floor. My pulse thudded faster. "Keep moving." Mason was waiting. It took less than a minute to find him, standing by the staff corkboard, flipping through a clipboard of requisition sheets. His face settled into that familiar, unshakable stillness that guided me and anyone else who'd ever gone under his lead. He glanced up as I approached, setting the clipboard down with careful purpose. "Ready for another round of questions?" His tone was even almost too casual, protective maybe, or testing the waters. "The doc already lectured me into the ground," I muttered, though my voice cracked just slightly at the middle. Mason's mouth twitched faintly at the edge, close to a smirk, almost, but when his eyes met mine, the weight behind them cut through any fleeting attempt at humor. "Come on," he said, motioning toward one of the empty back offices. Once the door clicked softly shut behind us, the air palpably moved. The usual hum of the station now felt like ambient noise, muffled behind thick particle board walls and faded posters of trail safety tips. Mason sank into a chair, the legs creaking faintly against the laminate floor, and laced his fingers. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. You still don't want to tell me what happened out there? It wasn't a question. The direct weight of it almost knocked me back anyway. I told you everything I remember, I said, keeping my voice steady even as my throat hitched slightly halfway through. Really? He studied me intently, eyes narrowing just enough to chip at my nerves. I turned slightly, letting my hands brush over the desk edge. Sturdy pine, gouged and scuffed from years of use. Sounds like you got your mind made up about it already. The words came out more defensive than I intended. Mason's expression didn't waver. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, his tone dipping lower. That place has more than its share of stories, you know that? His voice softened just slightly now, enough to make my teeth clench. You don't get into trouble out there without something putting you there. You understand? I met his gaze but kept my mouth shut. He didn't press further, not this time. The tension in the room simmered, heavy but static, before he leaned back and let out a slow, controlled sigh. All right, he said. I'm not dug in yet. Let me know if that changes. I nodded faintly. He stood, opening the door without so much as a farewell glance. That night, my house felt too small, too wide, too quiet. It wasn't the usual calm that came with the thick glass windows overlooking the back pines. Tonight, it was the kind of silence that followed you, dragging itself whispering through the cracks beneath the floorboards. I locked my door the moment I stepped in. Deadbolt, latch, then chain, even though silver pine didn't make you paranoid. It was a stubborn habit now. At some point, I found myself hunched over my desk in the small study, staring blankly at the card again. I'd retrieved it on instinct, pulled from the tape-sealed pocket of the duffel bag the hospital had returned. It was still blank, still damp. I flipped it back over, the coordinates Mirror Woods. That sick, biting jolt in my chest flared again, like it had been simmering. I slid the card carefully into the farthest drawer, shoving an old flashlight and a half-emptied packet of batteries on top. It didn't help much. The dread didn't leave. That night, I didn't sleep. I knew it couldn't be over. For now, Silverpine smiled for its tourists, basking in oblivion. But I stayed awake, a faint whisper still dragging at the edges of thought. Whatever lived in Mirror Woods wasn't at peace, and somehow I was still tethered to it. Can you withstand the unseen hunger of Mirror Woods, or will its darkness unravel your resolve?